Princess Diana stepped through the shadows of Kensington Palace's inner courtyard. No cameras, no crowds, just her and a single royal guard. She pulled him aside and whispered something that made his blood run cold. 3 words that would haunt him for 27 years. Because 6 days later, Diana was dead in a Paris tunnel. And the guard who heard her final warning knew exactly why. Now, before we reveal what she told him that night, make sure you're subscribed to our channel, Crown Guard, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Diana's death. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon that September evening in 1997, in the kind of steady drizzle that made the cobblestones in Kensington Palace's inner courtyard slick and dark as black glass. Amber light from wrought iron lanterns caught the wet stone, and the air smelled of autumn and secrets. Staff Sergeant Michael Langford stood at his post just inside the Eastern Service Gate. At 42, he'd spent 20 years in the Grenadier Guards, Afghanistan, Bosnia, and ceremonial duty in London. This quiet courtyard was different from his usual posts. No crowds, no cameras, just shadows, and the kind of place where important conversations happened after dark. That's when he saw her. Princess Diana stepped through a side entrance at the far end of the courtyard, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a soft click. She wasn't dressed for public appearances, just a simple cream blouse beneath a dark trench coat, collar turned up against the drizzle. In one hand, she carried a slim folder held close to her side. Her hair was slightly tousled, her makeup minimal, and she moved with quiet purpose, like someone who didn't want to be seen. For a heartbeat, Langford thought she might head toward the waiting cars in the far archway, but her gaze swept the courtyard and found him. There was no polite royal detachment in that look, something urgent, as though she'd been searching for exactly the right person and had decided he would do. She glanced over her shoulder, then began walking toward him, heels tapping softly against the wet stone. Langford kept his posture rigid, but his training made him notice everything. The tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tightened around the folder, how she kept checking the courtyard's edges. When she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the fine mist of rain on her coat, she didn't smile. "Sergeant," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his directly. "Walk with me, please." It wasn't an order, but there was no mistaking it for a request she expected to be refused. His orders were to remain at post, but some moments carry their own authority. He fell in 2 paces behind as they crossed toward a covered colonnade that ran along the east wing. The drizzle deepened as they moved toward the covered colonnade, their footsteps echoing in the semi-darkness. The stone pillars blocked most of the wind, creating pockets of shadow where the lantern light couldn't reach. "You've been with the Grenadiers some time," she began quietly. "Yes, ma'am. Over 20 years of operational service. Afghanistan twice. Bosnia before that." A faint smile touched her lips. Respect, not amusement. "So, you've seen enough to know when something feels off." They turned left, following a narrower walkway that skirted a walled garden. The rain fell harder now, and her voice dropped. "There are arrangements being made, changes to my place, my role." Langford kept his gaze ahead, scanning the path automatically for obstacles or potential threats. But his attention was entirely focused on her words and the way she was choosing to deliver them. This wasn't the kind of conversation that happened accidentally, and it wasn't the kind of information that got shared with random staff members without a specific purpose. "I wouldn't know about," he began, but she interrupted him gently, not cutting him off so much as redirecting the conversation away from the safe territory of professional ignorance. "No," she said, and there was something almost grateful in her voice, as if his discretion was exactly what she'd been hoping for. "I don't expect you to, but you understand the sort of people who make arrangements and how they speak when they're certain no one will challenge them." There was a pause, just long enough for the sound of the rain to fill the space between them and for Langford to process what she was really saying. She wasn't talking about official protocols or ceremonial adjustments. She was talking about something more personal, more dangerous, the kind of arrangements that happened in private conversations and altered the course of people's lives without ever appearing in official documents. He could feel her looking at him now, not directly, but in that peripheral way that allowed her to gauge his reaction without being obvious about it. She was deciding something, weighing how much she could trust a man she barely knew, with information that could be dangerous for both of them. "You know," she continued softly, her voice barely audible above the rain, "how in some situations you can sense when the decision's already been made, even before the meeting is over, even before anyone says anything definitive." He gave a single slow nod. Yes, ma'am. He did know. He'd sat in briefing rooms where officers discussed operations that would send people into danger, and had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguish genuine strategy meetings from exercises in confirming decisions that had already been reached behind closed doors. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the palace windows, faint squares of golden light that seemed impossibly distant from where they stood in the rain-soaked shadows. When she looked back at him, there was something in her expression that he'd seen before on the faces of soldiers who'd realized they were in more danger than their training had prepared them for. "That's where I am now," she said quietly. "The decisions are made. I'm an obstacle to be managed." They had reached a small stone archway at the far end of the garden wall, an architectural detail that created a natural alcove shadowed and recessed from the main path. She stepped into it without hesitation, and the sound of the rain immediately softened to a distant hiss. The stone walls created an intimacy that made the palace feel miles away instead of just yards. Here, in this pocket of darkness, the world felt narrowed to just the two of them. The light from the courtyard lanterns didn't reach this far, and the smell of wet ivy hung heavy in the air, earthy and old, in a way that spoke of secrets that had been kept in these shadows for decades, maybe centuries. She let out a slow breath, visible in the cool air, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter still, barely more than a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout could have. "I didn't bring you here for protocol, Sergeant," she said, and for the first time since she'd approached him, there was something that might have been vulnerability in her voice. "I needed someone who would listen and remember." Langford stood motionless, his training holding him steady. But inside he could feel the atmosphere shifting in a way that reminded him of moments in combat zones when the situation moved from routine to life and death without warning. This was no longer a casual conversation between a royal and a guard. Whatever she was about to say, it was personal, urgent, and it carried the kind of weight that changed people's lives. For a long moment, she didn't speak at all. The only sound was the rain beyond the alcove and the faint drip of water from the ivy above, a steady rhythm that seemed to mark time while she gathered herself for whatever came next. Langford waited, eyes forward, but aware of her presence beside him in a way that felt less like protocol and more like two people sharing something dangerous. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate, chosen with the care of someone who understood that some truths could only be spoken once. "Some people here see me as a problem," she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been fear. "Not in public, of course. Out there, I'm the smiling face in photographs, the charitable cause they can point to when they need to demonstrate compassion. But behind closed doors, in the conversations that matter, I'm an obstacle." Langford's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. In his experience, reacting too quickly could close a conversation before it truly began. And something told him that whatever she was building toward required patience, the kind of careful attention that allowed people to reveal dangerous truths at their own pace. She glanced toward the palace again, her expression unreadable in the shadows, but her posture suggesting someone who was acutely aware of being watched, even here in this hidden alcove. "I wasn't naive when I married into this," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact, but quiet. "I knew there were histories, preferences, a certain closeness between people that was never going to fade, no matter the vows made in public or the promises spoken in Westminster Abbey. She didn't name them. She didn't have to. The implication hung in the damp air between them, heavy with the weight of things that everyone knew but no one was supposed to acknowledge. The kind of open secret that shaped everything while officially existing nowhere. They wanted something different from the start, she said, voice calm but carrying a current of anger that she was working to keep controlled. A version of the monarchy that didn't include me in the picture. Not immediately, of course. That would have been too obvious, too messy, but eventually. And I think, no, I know they've been working toward it for years. Langford shifted his weight slightly, the movement slow enough to maintain his formal posture while acknowledging that he was listening, that he understood the significance of what she was telling him. He'd heard vague mutterings over the years in the guarded way that palace staff sometimes spoke when they thought they were out of earshot. Rumors and speculation that floated through the corridors like smoke. But hearing it from her, unvarnished and without the careful layers of official politeness, was different, more real, more dangerous. Her gaze returned to him, and in the dim light filtering through the ivy, he could see something in her eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of soldiers who'd realized they were in enemy territory without backup. "My shield has always been the public," she said. There was something almost clinical in the way she analyzed her own situation. As long as they want me there, as long as they see me as theirs instead of just another member of the family, I've been safe, protected by their affection in a way that makes it impossible for anyone to move against me directly. She paused, and Langford thought of Afghanistan, of the way an enemy might approach a well-defended position, not by charging it directly, but by undermining its support, cutting it off from allies and supply lines until it stood alone and vulnerable. "But lately," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "I can feel that shield being chipped away quietly, subtly. A few stories in the papers, a whisper here, just enough to make me seem unstable," she said, voice cool and exact. It was an officer's assessment delivered by someone who'd been forced to think like one. Beneath the calm was pain, the kind that comes from watching your reputation dismantled by people you once trusted. "I've overheard things," she went on. "They never use plain words. It's always euphemisms, resolving the situation, a new chapter, a path that works for everyone. They smile while they say it. That's what chills me." She looked toward the dripping arch. "They discuss my future, my removal from their future, with the same pleasant efficiency they'd use to plan a garden party. And they think I don't notice." She turned back to him. "But I do notice, Sergeant. People who see you as an obstacle eventually decide to remove you. The only question is, how?" The way she said it, not if, but how, sent a cold current through Langford that had nothing to do with the rain. She stepped deeper into shadow, lantern light slipping from her face. Langford subtly adjusted his stance, instincts sharpening. When she spoke again, it was a clean drop into silence. "It's Charles. And Camilla. It's always been them. No melodrama, just certainty. I tried to accept it, make the best of it. But lately, it's clear they want the throne as a pair. For that to happen cleanly, no scandal, no sympathy for the discarded wife, I must vanish. Not just step aside, vanish." The logic was brutal and precise. "Accidents happen to those who stand in the way too long," she said, as if stating whether. "If anything happens to me, you remember this conversation. Remember I never agreed to disappear into a convenient exile." Her gaze locked him in place, as binding as any battlefield order. "When it happens," she added, and those 3 words burned, "you'll understand. The timing, the circumstances, the explanations that make it seem inevitable instead of planned. And when you do, know it wasn't inevitable. It was chosen." Rain stitched the quiet. She moved past him, perfume ghosting the damp air. "Thank you for listening, for remembering when remembering becomes important." Then she was gone into the colonnade, the oak door closing on something permanent. Langford returned to his post in a world that looked the same, but wasn't. Her phrases looped in his mind. Accidents happen. When it happens, you'll understand. In the following days, details shifted. 2 unfamiliar men in rotation who wore the uniform correctly but carried themselves like private security. Access points quietly restricted. Changes explained as maintenance. A footman's casual mention. She's off to Paris at the weekend. That afternoon she stepped into a waiting car. Their eyes met through the window. A small, final smile. Farewell. 6 days later, the knock. "Sir, it's the princess. Paris. There's been an accident." The word didn't fit. By the time Langford reached the mess hall, blue lights flickered on television screens, a shaken voice intoning, "Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car crash in Paris." Reports trickled in. A late-night drive through the Pont de l'Alma. Paparazzi. A driver allegedly intoxicated. Security altered at the last minute. Her usual protection absent for reasons tidy on paper. He didn't need every detail. The framework was already lodged in his chest. It wasn't paranoia. It was the completion of a warning. The official language arrived, polished and careful. Tragic accident, pursuit, speed, intoxication. The phrasing carried grief while tidying away questions. Over the din, he still heard her. Accidents happen to those who stand in the way too long. When it happens, you'll understand everything. 3 days later, Langford stood at attention along the funeral route. One uniform among hundreds. London's grief felt raw and unmediated. The gun carriage passed under a drift of flowers and cameras. Faces in the procession were composed with public dignity. Meanings were positioned as carefully as people. The city watched, wept, and tried to name the shape of its loss. For Langford, it was confirmation. The timing, the circumstances, the convenience. It had unfolded with the neat precision of a plan executed well enough to look like fate. She had pulled him into the shadows not to share fear, but to pass a mission. Remember. He returned to duty. Boots square on wet stone, rifle balanced, expression regulation perfect. Inside, her voice threaded through the day. It wasn't inevitable. It was chosen. The investigation would conclude what investigations conclude when the stakes are high and the right people have enough to lose. Accident, tragedy, no evidence of conspiracy. Case closed. History soothed. But in the quiet corners of memory, her testimony held. 27 years on, it still does. He keeps the promise made under ivy and rain, to carry the unvarnished version of events entrusted to him in a conversation that lasted less than 30 minutes and would echo for the rest of his life. Do you think she knew exactly what was coming? And if you'd been that guard, would those words live with you forever? If this moved you, like subscribe, and share with someone who still wonders about her last days. Watch the videos now appearing on your screen for more stories like this.